So I want to just start out by clarifying a bit about what's happening here with these contracts for deeds. So these land contracts basically are lacking basic consumer protections for the folks that are engaging in them. So for example, in most situations, if you are in a mortgage and you miss a payment or so, you go into, at worst case, you go into sort of a foreclosure process. This is what happens with these buyers is that they go into this immediate forfeiture, like one missed payment, and you end up kind of losing everything. Is that right, Ms. Mancini?
Yes, Senator Smith. And the key thing about the forfeiture is there is no public auction of the home.
Right.
So in a foreclosure, at least there's a possibility that a third-party buyer could pay what the house is worth and the surplus would go to that former homeowner. But with a forfeiture, the seller just keeps the house.
The seller keeps everything, and the person who's been paying in doesn't have any opportunity for any kind of redress at all. Right?
That's right.
And then in a traditional mortgage, you would, there are certain things that Congress, I would say in their wisdom, have said are illegal activities. We learned this from the 2008 financial crisis. You can't have balloon payments. You can't have rapidly increasing monthly payments that basically price people out of an ability to own their own home. Do I have that basically right? Is that another important difference between these land contracts and mortgages?
We would argue that actually land contracts should be covered by the Dodd-Frank Act and those protections, but most actors are totally ignoring the Truth in Lending Act and all federal consumer laws. So if it's a true land contract, those laws really do apply, but they're being violated left and right, and no one is enforcing it.
So we do have federal laws to protect homeowners, including the Truth in Lending Act. But one of the challenges, and I think this gets to what Mr. Green is saying, one of the challenges that we have is we don't know where these are. We don't know who it is because there's no requirement to record these contracts in any way. Is that correct?
That's right. And even in the states where there is a recordation requirement, they're often violated. So you need, like Iowa, for example, says that if the contract is not recorded, the seller cannot enforce the contract. So that's a very powerful remedy. So you've got to think about how you do it.
Right. So not only is it not recorded, but there's no enforcement capacity.
That's right.
There. And, one thing I suspect people listening to this are, asking themselves, and Ms. Goodell, I'm going to turn to you on this, because you had an opportunity to work with some individuals who've been directly impacted by this. I think sometimes people might look at this and say, why would you enter into a contract that you don't know anything about? Or that it's sort of, the basic question is, how did you get taken advantage of, is the question. And so I'm wondering, Ms. Goodell, if you could just talk a bit about your experience with these individuals and help us understand a little bit about how people end up in these predatory and exploitive contract relationships.
Sure. Thank you, Senator Smith. My clients tend to have trusted the sellers, the people who approached them with a situation that maybe sounded too good to be true, and we know that often it is the case that it's not true. One of my clients said to me, why would this seller sell me a house that he knew I couldn't afford? And the answer that the seller would make a lot of money if you fail was beyond her understanding.
Yes.
She trusted that the seller was being reasonable.
This gets to a point that I think all of you have made in one way or another, which is that these contracts are designed to fail because that's how the seller makes more money. So the incentives are not aligned. The incentives are perverse. And that's why you have this sort of breakdown. Ms. Mancini, in your testimony, you suggested several actions that Congress could take in order to address this issue. Could you just go over those and talk to us a bit about that?
Certainly, Senator. One important piece that that everyone has touched on today is the idea of expanding access to the mortgage market for small dollar mortgages. And that can be done in a number of ways. But essentially, we need to encourage lenders to make small dollar loans, to incentivize it in a way. Even though the origination cost is the same for a $50,000 mortgage as a $500,000 mortgage, we need a system in which banks can't just say, we're not going to make loans to the low end of the market. They need to serve everyone. We also need more research on the prevalence of land contracts and the outcomes. And we need the CFPB, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and state attorneys general to look more at enforcement and to have the bandwidth to enforce existing laws.
Yep, yep. I've raised this question a couple of times also with the CFPB to understand something I think Senator Lummis is also we're trying to figure out, which is what is the interplay between state and federal law when it comes to these contracts? And then, Mr. Green, I want to come to you. So anybody.
Sorry.
So, yeah,
so
okay.
the interplay. So there can be both state and federal laws that regulate these transactions. That is fine. As I mentioned, the Truth in Lending Act does apply, and it has certain requirements, but it's fairly limited in what it does. And so states do still have the ability to impose further protections, and the federal government could as well.
Okay. Mr. Green, your business seems to me to be a model that is demonstrating that it is possible to provide smaller mortgages to folks that have, in many cases, been sort of blocked out of the mortgage market in order to buy their own home. And I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit more about what we can learn. Ms. Mancini is talking about how Congress should be looking at ways that we could provide incentives for traditional financial institutions to offer smaller dollar loans, and but I'm interested in that, but also like what you can tell us about what you've learned from your model about how to serve this particular group of Americans.
Sure. I think part of what makes our model possible, candidly, is the discounts that are achievable in the current market environment as a function partially of some of the enforcement actions that have been taken. So state AGs have pursued, in some cases, in very aggressive manners, perceived bad actors. And what that has done has prompted more desire to sell on the part of groups that would seek to hold, as previous investors have, but also created a chilled environment for would-be buyers that depresses the pricing for that. What we're able to accomplish largely exists within the margins of those discounts. And so by virtue of taking more aggressive enforcement actions against those perceived bad actors, it helps to keep pricing for these often overpriced instruments at a level that can allow for us to absorb the cost associated with providing these smaller balance mortgages. So we have the know-how, we have the financial capability, using levers like CRA, using CP programs and the like, and creating the sort of levers within institutions like Fannie and Freddie to ensure that their bulk sales don't inadvertently result in huge waves of REO properties being sold that are subsequently sold via contract. Because a big part of what happened in the wake of the GFC was precisely that if we look at our own portfolio, more than 2/3 of the properties were previously REO sales from Fannie or Freddie that were subsequently sold as CFDs. And so by putting both restraints on those, constraints from that activity, as well as actual enforcement to ensure that that doesn't happen, will help to keep pricing down and allow the capacity for groups like ours to be able to finance properties.
So what you're describing is in some ways a good partnership between the public sector and the private sector. The public sector is doing enforcement. It is holding accountable these bad actor buyers. Then you are in a position with the private investment that you can make to turn those properties into a good business opportunity and, very importantly, a good place for people to live. And it basically, in that sense, is able to solve the problem.
It is, I would say it advances meaningfully toward that. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the significant yeoman's effort that's involved. These are more difficult populations to serve. The geographically dispersed nature of our work requires us to have a team that has deep expertise and is really willing to roll up their sleeves to accomplish it. The families are deeply appreciative. That's consistent with our mission. I think that as a practical matter, you have to acknowledge that the difficulty of serving not only the primary mortgage market, but the deep need for secondary mortgages or any sort of capacity to be able to finance the improvements and deferred maintenance issues of these properties has to be similarly addressed. And we think that there have to be incentives to help prompt that.
Thank you. Senator Lummis, do you have any further questions?
I do, and thank you, Madam Chair.